All right, hello and welcome to the third and final screencast for Chapter 19. And this has been our introduction to macroeconomics, and we've been tackling one of the fundamental measures that we use in macroeconomics, and that's GDP. We spent the last two screencasts talking about how it's calculated, what it's good for, what we use it for. We're going to spend this screencast kind of talking about what may not be captured by GDP overall. What are some things we need to think about when we're talking about GDP as a measure of economic activity? We need to be careful with that number, and we don't want to use it for things which it wasn't designed to use. It's a particular measure designed for a particular purpose. So we said GDP is a measure of production, but it's often used as a proxy for the well-being of a society. Even when we do per capita and take out the effective population, right, so that we can compare, say, what was it earlier? We compared the size of China's economy with Germany's economy. There's still certain things that aren't captured in that GDP number. So we're going to look at a few of those major issues here in this screencast. So one of the biggest things that's a shortcoming of GDP is that it doesn't really take into account the value of non-market goods. So these are the value of goods and services that are produced but not necessarily sold as a final item. So this could be things like uncompensated household activities, right? Washing dishes, mowing lawns, cleaning, childcare. There's all sorts of productive economic activity that happens within a household, but we don't generally contract within our household. And I don't get paid for washing the dishes per se. I don't get a salary from my family for doing that. Those sorts of things are in-kind transfers within the household itself, and they don't show up anywhere in GDP overall. And it's not a trivial amount of economic activity that happens within a household. Another shortcoming of GDP is that it doesn't really take into account environmental quality. So just as an easy way of thinking about why might that be a problem, well, think about one country that produces 10 million units of output, but they have clean air and clean energy and everything's pristine, like this little artwork picture here, versus another country that has 10 million units of output, but they have no environmental standards at all. There's a lot of pollution, the air is clogged. They would have equal GDP, but well-being would be very different. So the well-being, using GDP, even GDP per capita, even real GDP per capita as a measure of well-being doesn't really capture something like environmental quality. Another thing is that the underground economy is not entirely captured by GDP. So what do we mean by the underground economy? Well, there's two components of it. It's not all illegal activity. Some of it is legal activity that just doesn't show up when NBER does the national accounting. It doesn't show up because it's usually just cash money paid to someone else, or sometimes it can be barter. So there are legal things like tips to waitresses. Increasingly those have started to be tracked and counted, but historically those haven't really shown up in any official statistics. There are estimates of it, but no real tracking of that money. And things like babysitting, if you hire the kid next door to cut your grass as opposed to doing it yourself, things like that, those kind of cash transfers, those usually don't end up showing up in GDP overall. And then, of course, we have the other part of the underground economy, the part we mostly think of when we think of underground economy. This is illegal activity, narcotics, prostitution, goods and services being sold that are not legal to be bought and sold, at least in the way that they're being bought and sold in that part of the economy. How big is the overall underground economy? Well, estimates are around 10% of U.S. GDP, that we could add another 10% onto GDP if the underground economy was included in that. Now, for the U.S., it's not great, 10% in terms of the mismeasurement of economic activity, but it's not huge. But in some developing countries, you can have a much bigger percentage there. So some estimates are as big as 45% of GDP on average in developing nations. And there's a wide variance there across developing countries there, but on average it's around 45%. That's a whole bunch of GDP that doesn't show up on the official statistics. Another shortcoming of GDP is that leisure time is not really counted, right? In terms of well-being, leisure time is super important, but there's no real accounting for that in terms of GDP. So if we're using real GDP per capita and looking at two different countries or two different states in the United States, two different regions, two different continents, whatever it is, we say, oh, well, they have a higher GDP per capita, therefore they must have higher well-being. Well, it just really depends, because leisure is not counted in that. In fact, leisure might reduce GDP overall. But in fact, leisure, usually we think of leisure as improving people's well-being overall. And in fact, there's a trade-off between labor and leisure. The average work week in different countries can be very different. In South Korea, at least when I pulled these statistics, it was 46 hours a week. In the Netherlands, it's 28 hours a week. So let's say they roughly had, and in the US, it's 36 hours a week. So let's say they roughly had the same GDP per capita. You might think, well, there's some very different levels of well-being that might be going on there once we accounted for leisure. In Japan, it's also 36 hours a week. So what are some other measures that we might want to use for well-being, maybe in addition to GDP per capita? I don't think it's a bad component of well-being. I think it certainly should be included, real GDP per capita, when we're thinking about the well-being of different political jurisdictions. But we may want to include some other measures to get a more robust or holistic picture of the well-being of different countries. Things like life expectancy, education levels, access to health care, crime rates might be an important component also for well-being. So I think all of these things, again, none of these things are really included explicitly in GDP. And so these are components of well-being. And so I think we should probably use a more multidimensional view of what well-being is besides just real GDP per capita. So let's end here on a little practice what you know. So which of the following things here would not be included in GDP? So I'll give you a little second here. Look at the options. Which one? Yeah, it's if Michael pays the neighbor kid to mow his yard, he probably doesn't report that on any sort of tax forms. None of that gets reported to the government, so the NBER is not able to include that in the national accounting statistics. All right, so that's the end of this first chapter, the end of the third screencast for that first chapter for macroeconomics, chapter 19 in the Mateer and Kappa book. I hope that helped explain some of the things, and if you have any questions, please let me know.